In the late 11th century, Europe and the Middle East stood at a pivotal crossroads of history. The Mediterranean world, long divided between Christian and Islamic spheres of influence, was about to witness a series of military expeditions that would fundamentally reshape political boundaries, cultural interactions, and religious relations for centuries to come. The Byzantine Empire, once the mighty eastern half of the Roman world, found itself increasingly threatened by Turkish advances in Anatolia. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, facing territorial losses and military pressure, reached out to Western Christendom for military assistance, a decision that would trigger consequences far beyond his imagination. Meanwhile, Europe itself was undergoing significant transformation. The feudal system had created a class of land-hungry knights and nobles, while population growth strained agricultural resources. Religious devotion permeated daily life, with pilgrimage to holy sites representing the highest form of piety for many Christians. Jerusalem, revered as the city where Christ had lived and died, held particular significance in the medieval Christian imagination. The relationship between Western and Eastern Christianity had grown increasingly strained. The Great Schism of 1054 had formalized the theological and liturgical divide between Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, creating suspicion and resentment that would complicate cooperation during the coming conflicts. In the Islamic world, political fragmentation had replaced the earlier unity of the Abbasid Caliphate. Seljuk Turks, Fatimids, and various local emirates competed for territory and influence across the Middle East. Jerusalem had been under Muslim control since the 7th century, though Christian pilgrims had generally been permitted to visit holy sites, an arrangement that would be jeopardized by changing political circumstances. This complex tapestry of religious fervor, political ambition, economic necessity, and cultural misunderstanding formed the backdrop for what would become known as the Crusades. When Pope Urban II rose to address the Council of Clermont in November 1095, he ignited a movement that would mobilize tens of thousands and create a new chapter in the relationship between Europe and the Middle East. The call to liberate Jerusalem would resonate across Europe, drawing participants from all social classes. For some, it offered spiritual redemption through holy combat. For others, the prospect of land, wealth, or adventure in distant territories. The crusading movement would ultimately span nearly 2 centuries, encompassing 9 major expeditions and numerous smaller campaigns, each with its distinct character, leadership, and outcome. What began as a response to Byzantine appeals for military aid would evolve into a complex phenomenon that defies simple categorization. Neither purely religious nor purely secular, neither entirely successful nor entirely failed. The Crusades would leave an indelible mark on 3 civilizations, creating memories and narratives that continue to influence international relations and religious discourse into the present day. The First Crusade emerged from a momentous gathering at the Council of Clermont in November 1095. There, Pope Urban II delivered an impassioned speech that would alter the course of European and Middle Eastern history. Standing before an assembly of clergy and nobles, Urban painted a vivid picture of Eastern Christians suffering under Muslim rule and holy places defiled by non-Christian control. From the confines of Jerusalem and the city of Constantinople, a horrible tale has gone forth, Urban declared. An accursed race has invaded the lands of Christians and has depopulated them by the sword, pillage, and fire. His appeal culminated in a call to arms. Undertake this journey for the remission of your sins, with the assurance of the imperishable glory of the kingdom of heaven. This theological framing proved extraordinarily effective. Urban promised full remission of sins to those who fought, a powerful incentive in a deeply religious society where salvation remained the ultimate concern. The response was immediate and enthusiastic, with many in the crowd reportedly crying, Deus vult, God wills it, which became the rallying cry of the crusading movement. The crusade that followed unfolded in two distinct phases. The first, known as the People's Crusade, demonstrated the fervor Urban's preaching had unleashed among the common population. Led by a charismatic French monk named Peter the Hermit, thousands of peasants, townspeople, and minor knights set out for Jerusalem in the spring of 1096, months before the organized military forces were prepared to depart. Lacking military discipline, adequate supplies, or effective leadership, these early crusaders carved a path of destruction across Europe. Jewish communities in the Rhineland suffered particularly devastating attacks, as some crusaders concluded that enemies of Christ could be found closer to home. When the People's Crusade reached Byzantine territory, Emperor Alexios, alarmed by their numbers and behavior, hastily transported them across the Bosporus. In October 1096, Turkish forces annihilated most of this undisciplined army near Nicaea, bringing the People's Crusade to a disastrous end. The second phase, the Princes' Crusade, proved more formidable. 4 main contingents, led by prominent nobles, departed from different regions of Europe in August and September 1096. From Lorraine came Godfrey of Bouillon, a pious and disciplined military leader who had sold or mortgaged most of his lands to finance his expedition. Accompanying him were his brothers Baldwin and Eustace. From southern Italy, the Norman Bohemond of Taranto led a smaller but highly professional force. A seasoned warrior who had previously fought against the Byzantines, Bohemond brought martial experience and personal ambition in equal measure. From southern France, Count Raymond of Toulouse commanded the largest contingent. Elderly by medieval standards at about 55, Raymond was nevertheless a devoted crusader who had taken a formal vow to reach Jerusalem. From northern France came forces under Robert of Normandy, Robert of Flanders, and Stephen of Blois, each powerful in his own right, though lacking the singular leadership of the other groups. By early 1097, these armies had converged at Constantinople, where they encountered a suspicious Emperor Alexios. The emperor demanded oaths of fealty and promises to return former Byzantine territories. Most leaders complied, though with varying degrees of sincerity. Byzantine guides and supplies were provided, and the combined Crusader army crossed into Anatolia. Their first major engagement came at Nicaea, the Turkish capital in western Anatolia, which fell in June 1097 after a coordinated Crusader-Byzantine siege. The following month, at Dorylaeum, the Crusaders repelled a major Turkish counterattack, securing their path through Anatolia. As they progressed eastward, the army endured scorching heat, limited water, and harassment from Turkish forces. In October 1097, the Crusaders reached Antioch, a formidable city protected by massive walls and hundreds of towers. What followed was a grueling 8-month siege that tested the limits of Crusader resolve. Starvation, disease, and desertion plagued their camp as winter set in. The situation grew so desperate that some knights, including prominent leader Stephen of Blois, abandoned the enterprise. The tide turned through a combination of perseverance and intrigue. Bohemond established contact with an Armenian guard commander named Firuz, who agreed to betray the city. On the night of June 2nd, 1098, Bohemond's men scaled the walls at a section under Firuz's command, opened the gates, and the Crusader army poured into Antioch. The victory proved short-lived. Just 3 days later, a massive relief army, led by Kaboga of Mosul, arrived, trapping the exhausted Crusaders inside the city they had just captured. With retreat impossible and supplies dwindling, morale collapsed. At this critical juncture, a remarkable event revitalized the Crusader cause. A peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have received visions revealing the location of the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side during the crucifixion. Despite skepticism from some leaders, an excavation in Antioch's cathedral uncovered an iron point. Whether authentic or contrived, the discovery electrified the common soldiers. On June 28th, the reinvigorated Crusader army emerged from Antioch in battle formation. Against all military logic, they routed Kaboga's superior force. Many Crusaders attributed this victory to divine intervention, further cementing their belief in the righteous nature of their mission. The triumph at Antioch created its own complications. Bohemond claimed the city as his prize, despite earlier oaths to return conquered territories to Byzantine control. This established the first Crusader state, the Principality of Antioch, and set a precedent for Crusader territorial acquisitions. After recovering at Antioch, the crusade continued southward in January 1099, with numbers significantly reduced through combat, disease, and the garrison left in Antioch. Raymond of Toulouse now emerged as the de facto leader, though tensions persisted among the commanders. The march down the Levantine coast proceeded relatively unopposed, as local emirs often preferred negotiation to confrontation. By June 7th, 1099, approximately 12,000 Crusaders reached Jerusalem, the culmination of a journey spanning nearly 3 years and thousands of miles. Jerusalem, then under Fatimid Egyptian control, presented a formidable challenge with its massive walls and adequate garrison. The Crusaders' initial assault on June 13th failed due to insufficient siege equipment. Recognizing the need for more substantial preparations, the leaders organized teams to construct wooden towers, catapults, and other siege weapons. Meanwhile, the army suffered from extreme heat and water shortages, as all local sources had been poisoned or drained by the defenders. On July 15th, after a night of religious processions around the city walls, the Crusaders launched their final assault. Godfrey's forces breached the northern wall, while Raymond's men entered from the southwest. What followed was an infamous bloodbath that shocked even medieval contemporaries. The Crusaders, inflamed by religious zeal and the hardships of their journey, slaughtered thousands of Jerusalem's inhabitants, Muslims, Jews, and even some Eastern Christians. Contemporary accounts describe streets flowing with blood and Crusaders wading ankle-deep through carnage. While these may represent literary exaggeration, archaeological and primary sources confirm extensive violence against the civilian population. After the conquest, the Crusader leaders established the Kingdom of Jerusalem as the fourth Crusader state, joining the county of Edessa, founded by Baldwin in 1098. The Principality of Antioch, claimed by Bohemond, and the county of Tripoli, later consolidated by Raymond's successors. Godfrey of Bouillon became the kingdom's first ruler, though he declined the title of king, preferring Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. Upon his death in 1100, his brother Baldwin I embraced the royal title, formalizing the political structure of the new realm. The First Crusade achieved what subsequent expeditions could not: the conquest of Jerusalem and establishment of Latin Christian states in the Levant. This remarkable success stemmed from a unique combination of factors: religious fervor, military capability, leadership talent, despite frequent conflicts. and most crucially, disunity among Muslim powers in the region. The Seljuk Turks and Fatimid Egyptians, rivals for regional dominance, failed to coordinate resistance against the common Christian threat until it was too late. The conquest of Jerusalem electrified Europe. Urban II, who had initiated the enterprise, died without learning of its success. For many contemporaries, the victory validated the entire crusading concept, demonstrating divine favor for the Christian cause. The stage was set for a prolonged Western presence in the Holy Land, and the inevitable Muslim response that would necessitate future crusades. By the mid-1140, the Crusader states established in the wake of the First Crusade faced mounting challenges. The Muslim world, initially fragmented during the Christian advance, began a process of political and military consolidation. This shifting balance of power first manifested in a significant Christian defeat, the fall of the county of Edessa. In December 1144, Imad ad-Din Zengi, the Turkish Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo, captured Edessa after a brief siege. The city, the first Crusader state to be established and the most eastern outpost of Latin presence, fell in a single day. Its Christian population faced massacre or enslavement, and the shocking loss reverberated throughout Europe. News of Edessa's fall reached Pope Eugenius III in autumn 1145. Recognizing the potential domino effect this defeat might trigger, he issued the papal bull Quantum Predecessores, calling for a new crusade. Unlike Urban II's appeal 50 years earlier, this call to arms initially received a tepid response. The European political landscape had evolved, with monarchs more firmly established and less inclined toward distant ventures. The crusading movement found its champion in Bernard, abbot of Clairvaux. A towering religious figure of his age, Bernard possessed extraordinary charisma and moral authority. Where the papal bull had failed to ignite enthusiasm, Bernard's preaching generated remarkable fervor. At Vézelay, in March 1146, his impassioned sermon before King Louis VII of France and his court resulted in a dramatic scene. Nobles tearing their garments to fashion makeshift crosses, the traditional symbol of crusade participation. Louis VII embraced the crusading cause with particular enthusiasm. Young, pious, and seeking to atone for his role in a church burning at Vitry that had killed hundreds, Louis saw the expedition as both religious duty and opportunity for personal redemption. His decision to crusade carried political significance as well, given France's growing national identity and royal authority. The crusade gained further momentum when Conrad III, King of Germany and head of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, committed to the enterprise after Bernard's preaching at Frankfurt. Conrad became the first German king to take the cross, bringing the two dominant powers of Western Europe into the campaign. A distinctive feature of the Second Crusade was the participation of Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, who accompanied her husband Louis. Intelligent, strong-willed, and politically astute, Eleanor brought a substantial contingent from her vast hereditary domains in southwestern France. Her presence highlighted the complex intermingling of religious devotion, political calculation, and personal motivation that characterized the crusading movement. The Second Crusade also expanded geographically beyond the traditional Eastern Mediterranean theater. In the Iberian Peninsula, crusading forces assisted local Christian kingdoms in their campaigns against Muslim territories, a parallel conflict known as the Reconquista. Simultaneously, Saxon nobles launched campaigns against pagan Slavic peoples along the Baltic coast, attaching crusading ideology to the expansion of German influence eastward. This geographic diversification reflected both the elasticity of crusading concepts and the political utility of holy war rhetoric. The main Eastern expedition began with great promise, but quickly encountered difficulties. Conrad's German army departed first in May 1147, following the Danube route to Constantinople. Poorly disciplined and inadequately supplied, the Germans engaged in plundering Byzantine territory, creating tensions with Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, who had reluctantly agreed to support the venture. The French army, better organized, followed a similar route, but maintained stricter discipline. When Louis arrived at Constantinople in October 1147, he found the Germans had already proceeded into Anatolia. The Byzantine emperor, increasingly suspicious of Western intentions after the First Crusade's outcomes, provided guides but limited additional assistance. Conrad, ignoring Byzantine advice to follow the coastal route, led his forces directly across Anatolia's central plateau. Near Dorylaeum, where the First Crusade had triumphed, Conrad's army suffered a devastating defeat at Turkish hands on October 25, 1147. The surviving Germans retreated to Nicaea, where the arriving French forces encountered them in a state of disarray. Louis chose to continue along the coastal route, but encountered his own difficulties. Turkish attacks, challenging terrain, and supply issues gradually wore down French morale and fighting capability. By early 1148, when the Crusaders reached Antalya on the southern coast of Anatolia, the situation had deteriorated to the point where Louis abandoned the land route entirely. The king and his nobles secured ships to sail to Antioch, leaving thousands of common pilgrims and infantry behind, many of whom perished or were enslaved. The arrival of the Crusades' remnants in Antioch in March 1148 introduced new complications. Raymond of Poitiers, Prince of Antioch, and Eleanor's uncle, pressed for the Crusaders to assist in recapturing Edessa or attacking Aleppo, the center of Zengi's power. These proposals aligned with the Crusades' original purpose, but conflicted with Jerusalem's strategic interests. Personal and political tensions further complicated military planning. Eleanor expressed support for her uncle's proposals, and according to some sources, developed an inappropriately close relationship with Raymond. Louis, enraged by perceived slights to his honor and authority, departed Antioch abruptly, compelling Eleanor to accompany him to Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, King Baldwin III and the High Court convened a war council at Acre with Louis, Conrad, and other Crusade leaders. Despite the logical strategic focus on securing Edessa or weakening Zengi's successor, Nur ad-Din, the council made the fateful decision to attack Damascus. This decision reflected Jerusalem's immediate concerns, rather than broader crusading objectives. Damascus, though Muslim-controlled, had generally maintained peaceful relations with the Crusader states as a buffer against more aggressive Muslim powers. The attack thus threatened to eliminate a potential ally and drive Damascus into alliance with Nur ad-Din, precisely what eventually occurred. The Siege of Damascus, beginning on July 24, 1148, rapidly descended into failure. The Crusaders initially secured positions in the orchards west of the city, but made a disastrous tactical decision to move to the eastern side, where water and supplies were scarce and the terrain offered no natural cover. Rumors of Nur ad-Din's approaching relief army, combined with suspicions of betrayal among the Crusader factions, led to the siege's abandonment after just 4 days. This humiliating retreat effectively ended the military phase of the Second Crusade. Conrad returned to Germany in September 1148, while Louis remained in Jerusalem until spring 1149, accomplishing little beyond visits to holy sites. When he finally returned to France in November 1149, The Second Crusade could claim no significant achievement in the East. The expedition's failure triggered recrimination and soul-searching throughout Europe. Bernard of Clairvaux, who had promised divine support for the venture, faced particular criticism. He defended the crusade by comparing crusaders to Israelites in the Bible, tested by God through suffering, and blamed the outcome on the sins of the participants. This theological rationalization established a pattern for explaining crusading failures that would persist through subsequent expeditions. Beyond its immediate military disappointment, the Second Crusade carried significant long-term consequences. It demonstrated the logistical challenges of moving large armies across Anatolia, especially without Byzantine cooperation. The strategic incoherence of the campaign, culminating in the ill-conceived attack on Damascus, revealed the conflicting interests between European crusaders and established Latin states in the East. For Muslim leaders, particularly Nur ad-Din, the Crusades' failure validated their strategy of greater unity and coordinated resistance. Damascus, alienated by the Crusader attack, gradually fell under Nur ad-Din's influence, strengthening the anti-Crusader coalition. The Muslim world began to embrace jihad ideology more explicitly as a counterweight to crusading rhetoric. In Europe, the Second Crusade's failure dampened enthusiasm for large-scale expeditions, but did not extinguish the crusading ideal. Subsequent crusade planners would attempt to address the strategic and logistical failings revealed during this campaign. Meanwhile, the ongoing development of military orders, particularly the Templars and Hospitallers, provided the Crusader states with dedicated defensive capabilities to offset their chronic manpower shortages. The experience of the Second Crusade demonstrated that the initial success of crusading could not be easily replicated. As the 12th century progressed, both Christians and Muslims adapted their strategies and ideologies for a protracted struggle over the Holy Land, a conflict that would soon produce new champions and a more sophisticated approach to holy war. The 4 decades following the Second Crusade witnessed a dramatic shift in the balance of power in the Near East. While the Crusader states struggled with internal divisions and succession disputes, the Muslim world experienced unprecedented unification under a leader of remarkable ability, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to history as Saladin. Born to a Kurdish military family in 1137, Saladin rose through service to Nur ad-Din, the Turkish ruler who had consolidated Muslim territories following the Second Crusade. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, Saladin maneuvered to take control of Damascus and eventually Cairo, uniting Syria and Egypt under his leadership. Through a combination of military prowess, political acumen, and religious conviction, he established the Ayyubid dynasty and positioned himself as the champion of Islam against the Crusader presence. Unlike many of his predecessors, Saladin approached the conflict with the Latin states systematically. He strengthened his economic and military foundations, neutralized potential Muslim rivals, and carefully observed the Crusader states for signs of vulnerability. His reputation for justice and adherence to Islamic law earned him widespread support, while his strategic vision enabled him to pursue long-term objectives rather than immediate gains. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, meanwhile, faced mounting internal challenges. King Baldwin IV, though a capable ruler, suffered from leprosy, which progressively limited his ability to govern and lead armies. Succession became increasingly contentious, with factions forming around potential heirs and regents. The most prominent division emerged between the court party, led by Raymond III of Tripoli, advocating cautious coexistence with Muslim neighbors, and the aggressive war party centered around Reynold of Châtillon and Guy of Lusignan. Reynold, the Lord of Ultra-Jourdain, repeatedly violated truces with Saladin by attacking Muslim caravans and pilgrims, including a raid in 1183 that threatened the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. These provocations gave Saladin legitimate cause for war, while undermining the kingdom's diplomatic position. The internal Crusader conflicts came to a head in 1186, when Guy of Lusignan, married to Baldwin IV's sister Sibylla, claimed the throne following a series of deaths in the royal family. Raymond III refused to recognize Guy's kingship and initially maintained a separate peace with Saladin. This division proved catastrophic when Reynold provoked Saladin once more in 1187 by attacking a large caravan despite an existing truce. Saladin demanded compensation, which Guy failed to secure from the defiant Reynold. With religious justification and political opportunity aligned, Saladin declared the truce void and mobilized the largest Muslim army the region had seen since the First Crusade. The crisis forced a reconciliation between Guy and Raymond, but their united army still faced overwhelming odds. Against Raymond's advice, Guy decided to march from the safety of Tiberias to confront Saladin's forces directly. This decision led to the defining battle of the period at the Horns of Hattin on July 4th, 1187. The Crusader army, suffering from heat and thirst after Saladin blocked their access to water sources, found itself surrounded on the plateaus west of the Sea of Galilee. The battle became a slow, methodical destruction of Crusader fighting capacity. When it ended, nearly the entire military strength of the Kingdom of Jerusalem lay dead or captured. King Guy, Reynold, and most of the noble leadership fell into Saladin's hands, along with the kingdom's most sacred relic, a fragment of the true cross that had accompanied the army into battle. Saladin personally executed Reynold for his oath-breaking and raids against Muslim pilgrims, but treated most other captives according to the chivalric standards of the age. The military orders suffered particularly harsh treatment. Saladin offered Templar and Hospitaller knights the choice of conversion to Islam or death, and most chose the latter. With the kingdom's field army destroyed, Saladin methodically reduced its fortresses and cities. Jerusalem, the ultimate prize, surrendered on October 2nd, 1187, after a brief siege. Unlike the bloodbath that had followed the First Crusade's capture of the city, Saladin permitted an orderly evacuation, allowing most Christians to ransom themselves and take portable possessions. His magnanimity enhanced his reputation, while drawing explicit contrast with earlier Christian behavior. By the end of 1187, the Crusader presence had been reduced to a few coastal strongholds, primarily Tyre, which was successfully defended by Conrad of Montferrat, a newly arrived European noble. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, established with such effort during the First Crusade, had effectively ceased to exist as a territorial reality. News of Jerusalem's fall sent shockwaves through Europe. Pope Gregory VIII issued the bull Audita Tremendi, calling for peace among Christian kingdoms and a new crusade to recover the Holy City. The response from European monarchs proved more substantial than for any crusade since the first. 3 of Western Europe's most powerful rulers took the cross: Frederick I Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, Philip II Augustus, King of France, and Richard I, newly crowned King of England. This unprecedented coalition of royal leadership earned the expedition its historical designation as the King's Crusade. Frederick Barbarossa, at nearly 70 years old, represented the oldest and most experienced of the 3 monarchs. Having participated in the Second Crusade as a young man, he brought unmatched prestige and the largest army estimated at 100,000 men, including 20,000 knights. Departing in May 1189, Frederick chose the land route through Hungary and Byzantine territory. Despite initial diplomatic complications with the Byzantine Emperor Isaac II Angelus, Frederick's massive army proceeded efficiently through Anatolia, defeating Turkish forces at Iconium in May 1190. Then disaster struck. On June 10th, while crossing the Salef River in Cilicia, Frederick drowned in circumstances that remain unclear. His death shattered German morale. Most of his army disintegrated, with only a small fraction continuing to the Holy Land under his son, Frederick of Swabia. The Anglo-French contingent took a different approach. Wary of the land route's dangers, Richard and Philip transported their forces by sea. Their preparations were extensive. Both levied special taxes, the Saladin tithe, to finance the expedition. The two kings met in Vézelay in July 1190 to coordinate plans, then proceeded to Sicily, where they wintered while awaiting favourable sailing conditions. The Sicily layover exposed underlying tensions between the monarchs. Richard negotiated aggressively with the Sicilian ruler Tancred, eventually securing additional ships and supplies by force. Philip, more reserved and calculating, grew increasingly resentful of Richard's flamboyant leadership style and military reputation. Their uneasy alliance further deteriorated when Richard formally repudiated his long-standing betrothal to Philip's sister Alice, announcing his intention to marry Berengaria of Navarre instead. Richard's fleet departed Sicily in April 1191, but encountered a storm that scattered his ships. Several vessels wrecked on Cyprus, then ruled by Isaac Komnenos, a rogue Byzantine governor, who imprisoned survivors and seized their property. Richard responded with characteristic decisiveness, conquering the island in May 1191. This unplanned conquest proved strategically valuable, providing the Crusaders a secure supply base free from Muslim threat. Richard later sold Cyprus to the Templars, who subsequently transferred it to Guy of Lusignan, establishing a new Latin kingdom that would endure long after the mainland Crusader states fell. Richard finally arrived at the Siege of Acre in June 1191, joining forces already assembled under Philip and local Crusader leaders. The siege had begun in August 1189, becoming one of the longest and most complex military operations of the medieval period. The city's Muslim garrison resisted tenaciously, while Saladin's field army harassed the besiegers from outside, creating a double challenge for Crusader forces. Richard's arrival reinvigorated the siege operations. His military expertise, particularly in siege warfare, accelerated progress against Acre's defences. The city surrendered on July 12, 1191, after negotiators agreed that the garrison could depart in exchange for 200,000 gold pieces, the release of Christian captives, and the return of the True Cross. The aftermath of Acre's fall marked the beginning of the Crusades' disintegration as a unified effort. Philip Augustus, citing illness and political concerns about succession in France, departed for home on July 31st, leaving Richard as the sole king commanding the expedition. Though Philip left a substantial contingent under the Duke of Burgundy, his departure damaged Crusader morale and unity. Tensions escalated in August when the negotiated ransom payments from Acre fell behind schedule. Richard, impatient with delays, ordered the execution of approximately 2,700 Muslim prisoners from the Acre garrison, an act that shocked contemporaries on both sides and hardened Saladin's resolve. With Acre secured, Richard began his march south toward Jerusalem in August 1191. Saladin shadowed the Crusader army, avoiding direct confrontation until he could choose favourable terrain. On September 7th, near Arsuf, Saladin launched a major attack on the marching Crusader forces. Richard demonstrated his tactical brilliance, maintaining disciplined formation under repeated cavalry charges until the perfect moment, then unleashing a devastating counterattack that drove Saladin's forces from the field. The victory at Arsuf enhanced Richard's already formidable reputation and provided a temporary strategic advantage. The Crusader army continued south, eventually reaching Jaffa, which Richard fortified as a forward base. However, as autumn turned to winter, the campaign's momentum slowed. Richard fell ill, supply lines became stretched, and disagreements emerged among Crusader leadership about strategic priorities. The subsequent months evolved into a strategic chess match between Richard and Saladin. Richard twice advanced toward Jerusalem, reaching the village of Beit Nuba, just 12 miles from the Holy City, in January 1192 and June 1192. Each time, concerns about logistics, weather, and the sustainability of any conquest forced a withdrawal. Between these advances, Richard focused on consolidating the coastal territories and rebuilding key fortresses, particularly Ascalon in the south. He recognized that without secure supply lines and defensible positions, any capture of Jerusalem would likely prove temporary. This pragmatic approach conflicted with the rank-and-file Crusaders' expectation of recovering the Holy City, creating tension within the Crusader camp. As 1192 progressed, both Richard and Saladin faced increasing pressures toward negotiation. Richard received troubling reports about his brother John's activities in England and Philip Augustus's designs on his French territories. Saladin confronted war weariness among his troops and political challenges to his authority after years of continuous campaigning. The two leaders never met in person, but conducted negotiations through intermediaries, developing a mutual respect despite their opposition. In September 1192, after a final display of Richard's military prowess in the relief of Jaffa, they concluded the Treaty of Jaffa. The agreement established a 3-year truce, confirmed Crusader control of the coastline from Tyre to Jaffa, and guaranteed unarmed Christian pilgrims free access to Jerusalem. The treaty represented a compromise that fell short of the Crusades' original objectives, but reflected battlefield realities. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, but the Crusader presence in the Levant had been rescued from near extinction following Hattin. The coastal territories would form the nucleus of a reconstituted Kingdom of Jerusalem, though one significantly reduced in size and power. Richard departed the Holy Land on October 9th, 1192, his journey home turning into an odyssey when storms forced his ship to land in territory controlled by his enemy, Duke Leopold of Austria. Traveling in disguise, Richard was recognized, captured, and eventually transferred to the custody of Emperor Henry VI, who demanded an enormous ransom for his release. He finally returned to England in March 1194 after more than a year in captivity. The Third Crusade, though failing to recapture Jerusalem, achieved significant military successes that ensured Latin Christian presence in the Holy Land for another century. The expedition demonstrated both the heights of medieval military capability and the limitations of crusading as a strategic concept. The organizational challenges of coordinating multinational forces, maintaining supply lines across vast distances, and reconciling diverse political objectives with religious idealism all constrained the Crusade's effectiveness. For European observers, the Third Crusade generated enduring cultural and historical narratives. Richard's exploits became the stuff of legend, earning him the epithet Lionheart and a prominent place in the emerging chivalric literature of the period. The strategic duel between Richard and Saladin, characterized by mutual respect between worthy adversaries, established a template for honorable conflict that would influence Western concepts of warfare for centuries. In the Muslim world, Saladin's successful defense of Jerusalem, combined with his ethical treatment of enemies and strict adherence to Islamic principles, elevated him to the status of ideal Islamic ruler. His unification of Egypt and Syria under the Ayyubid dynasty reshaped the political landscape of the region, though his achievements proved difficult for his successors to maintain after his death in March 1993, just months after Richard's departure. The Third Crusade marked the high point of classic crusading warfare. Large-scale, monarchy-led expeditions aimed at reclaiming Jerusalem through direct military confrontation. Future crusades would explore different approaches, reflecting both the lessons learned from the King's Crusade and the evolving political realities of Europe and the Middle East. The Fourth Crusade stands as perhaps the most controversial of all crusading expeditions, an endeavor that began with Jerusalem as its target, but culminated in the conquest and sack of Constantinople, the greatest Christian city of the medieval world. This extraordinary diversion from stated purpose to actual outcome reveals the complex interplay of religious idealism, political calculation, economic interests, and opportunism that characterized the crusading movement by the early 13th century. The origins of the Fourth Crusade lay in the ambitious vision of Pope Innocent III, who ascended to the papal throne in 1998 at the age of 37. Intellectually brilliant and administratively gifted, Innocent envisioned the papacy as the supreme moral and political authority in Christendom. A new crusade formed a central element of his broader agenda to assert papal leadership and reform Christian society. In August 1198, Innocent issued the bull Post Miserabile, calling for a new expedition to recover Jerusalem. Unlike previous crusade appeals, this bull outlined a comprehensive strategy focused on Egypt as the key to success. The Pope recognized that Egypt represented both the economic heartland of Muslim power and the most vulnerable approach to the Holy Land. By conquering Egypt first, Crusaders could secure a strong base for operations against Jerusalem, while cutting off resources to Muslim forces in Syria and Palestine. Initial recruitment efforts met with limited success until a tournament in Champagne in November 1199, where several prominent French nobles took the cross, including Count Thibaut of Champagne, Count Louis of Blois, and Count Baldwin of Flanders. Thibaut emerged as the expedition's nominal leader, though his unexpected death in May 1201 transferred leadership to Boniface of Montferrat, an experienced Italian nobleman with connections to both the Byzantine Empire and the Crusader states. The newly recruited Crusaders made a pivotal decision in early planning stages: to travel by sea rather than attempt the arduous land route through Anatolia. This sensible choice led them to negotiate with Venice, the preeminent maritime power of the Mediterranean, for the construction and provision of a massive transport fleet. In March 1201, Crusade representatives concluded an agreement with the 85-year-old but still shrewd Doge Enrico Dandolo. Venice would build transport vessels for 33,500 men and 4,500 horses, provide 9 months of provisions, and contribute 50 war galleys of its own, all for the immense sum of 85,000 silver marks. The contract stipulated that payment would be due when the Crusaders assembled in Venice in June 1202. This arrangement proved disastrous when only about 1/3 of the expected Crusader forces arrived at the appointed time. Many contingents had chosen alternate embarkation points or abandoned the enterprise entirely, leaving those who faithfully gathered in Venice unable to fulfill the financial obligation. The assembled Crusaders, despite liquidating their available assets, fell 34,000 marks short of the required payment. Venice, having redirected much of its commercial capacity to fulfill its contractual obligations, faced significant economic strain. This financial crisis created the conditions for the first major diversion from the Crusades' intended path. Doge Dandolo proposed a solution. The Crusaders could defer payment by assisting Venice in recapturing Zara, modern Zadar, in Croatia, a former Venetian possession that had rebelled and placed itself under Hungarian protection. The Crusade leaders reluctantly accepted, despite the moral complications of attacking a city belonging to the King of Hungary, who had himself taken the Crusaders' vow. When Pope Innocent learned of this plan, he explicitly prohibited the attack and threatened excommunication for any who participated. Nevertheless, the combined Venetian Crusader force sailed from Venice in October 1202 and besieged Zara in November. The city fell after a brief resistance, and the attackers spent the winter there while determining their next move. Innocent excommunicated the entire expedition, but later rescinded the spiritual penalty for the French Crusaders, maintaining it only for the Venetians. This partial absolution allowed the crusade to continue, albeit under an ethical cloud. While at Zara, the crusade leaders received a proposal that would fundamentally alter their mission. Envoys arrived from Prince Alexios Angelos, son of the deposed Byzantine Emperor Isaac II. Isaac had been overthrown and blinded in 1195 by his brother, who ruled as Alexios III. The young Alexios, who had escaped to the west, offered substantial rewards if the Crusaders would help restore his father to the throne. 200,000 silver marks, provisions for the entire army, a contingent of 10,000 Byzantine soldiers for the Egyptian campaign, and the maintenance of 500 knights in the Holy Land. Most significantly, he promised to end the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity by bringing the Greek Orthodox Church under papal authority. This offer created deep divisions within the Crusade leadership. Some, particularly those associated with the Cistercian order and committed to the original purpose, opposed any further deviation from the Egyptian strategy. Others, including Boniface of Montferrat and the Venetians, argued that the Byzantine detour would ultimately strengthen the expedition through additional resources and solve the persistent financial crisis. The Byzantine proposal prevailed, though not without further fracturing the crusade. A substantial minority of crusaders, unwilling to attack Christian Constantinople, departed for the Holy Land directly or returned home. The remaining force sailed for Constantinople in April 1203, arriving before the Byzantine capital on June 24th. Few medieval cities could match Constantinople's magnificence or defences. Protected by massive walls and the natural barrier of the Bosporus, the city had withstood numerous sieges throughout its 9th-century history. With a population approaching 500,000, it dwarfed any Western European urban centre. Its churches, palaces, and monuments housed artistic and religious treasures accumulated over centuries of imperial power. The initial Crusader assessment recognized these formidable challenges, but also identified key vulnerabilities. Emperor Alexios III had neglected military preparedness, and the city's once dominant navy had deteriorated. Moreover, the emperor's usurpation of power and subsequent misrule had generated significant internal dissatisfaction. On July 17th, 1203, the Crusaders launched a coordinated land and sea assault on the city. The Venetian fleet overcame the harbour chain and established a beachhead near the Palace of Blakeney, while the Crusader Knights engaged Byzantine forces outside the walls. Though the attackers could not breach the main defences, the limited military response convinced Alexios III that his position was untenable. Under cover of darkness, he fled the city with significant treasury funds, abandoning his subjects to their fate. The Byzantine court hurriedly restored the blind Isaac II to the throne and admitted Prince Alexios, who was crowned Alexios IV as co-emperor. The Crusaders had apparently achieved their immediate objective without capturing the city. The reinstated emperors welcomed the Western forces as allies and arranged their encampment across the Golden Horn at Galata. However, the promised rewards soon proved problematic. The imperial treasury, depleted by decades of mismanagement and Alexios III's theft, could not produce the agreed sum. Alexios IV managed to pay only part of the amount by confiscating church property and imposing special taxes, measures that rapidly eroded his popular support. The promised religious union with Rome generated intense opposition from Orthodox clergy and laity, who viewed it as betrayal of their theological traditions. As months passed and payments lagged, relations deteriorated between the Crusaders and Byzantines. Alexios IV, caught between Western demands and his subjects' resentment, grew increasingly desperate. In December 1203, fire broke out during a riot between local citizens and Western soldiers, destroying a sizable portion of the city. This catastrophe further inflamed anti-Latin sentiment and weakened Alexios IV's tenuous position. By January 1204, popular discontent culminated in revolution. A court official named Alexios Doukas, nicknamed Mortzouflos for his prominent eyebrows, led a palace coup, imprisoning Alexios IV and reinstating imperial resistance to Crusader demands. Shortly thereafter, the young emperor was strangled and his blind father died, reportedly from shock. Mortzouflos was crowned Emperor Alexios V and immediately adopted a confrontational stance, strengthening the city's defenses and ordering the Crusader camp bombarded. These events transformed the political calculus for the Crusader leadership. With their supposed ally dead and the new regime openly hostile, they faced difficult choices: retreat in failure, proceed to Egypt with depleted resources, or attempt to take Constantinople by force. Economic necessity, combined with a sense of betrayal and the prospect of unprecedented plunder, led them toward the third option. To legitimize this extraordinary step, the Crusaders and Venetians drafted a treaty in March 1204, establishing procedures for dividing spoils and governing the conquered city. This agreement included provisions for selecting a Latin emperor, with Venetians controlling appointment of the patriarch. The Crusade leaders also sought theological justification, characterizing the Byzantines as traitors to Christendom who had murdered their legitimate ruler and rejected church unity. On April 9th, 1204, the Crusaders launched their assault on Constantinople's sea walls. This initial attack failed, with the Byzantine defenders repelling the invaders. Desperately low on supplies and facing potential catastrophe, the Crusader forces regrouped for a final effort on April 12th. This time, favorable winds aided the Venetian ships in coming alongside the walls, allowing their specially constructed bridges to deploy effectively. Several small groups of Crusaders established footholds on the walls and opened gates from within. By the afternoon of April 12th, the fate of the 1,000-year Byzantine Empire was sealed. Emperor Alexios V fled, and on April 13th, the Crusaders entered Constantinople as conquerors rather than allies. What followed was 3 days of indiscriminate looting, destruction, and violence that shocked even hardened medieval contemporaries. The Venetians generally focused on portable wealth and valuable artifacts, particularly the 4 bronze horses that would adorn San Marco Cathedral. The Crusader knights and infantry, however, engaged in widespread destruction and desecration. Churches were systematically stripped of relics, gold, and precious items. Sacred vessels were used for drinking parties. Nuns were violated in their convents. The great church of Hagia Sophia, Christendom's largest and most revered building for 7 centuries, saw its altar smashed, its silver iconostasis melted down, and its sacred spaces used for debauchery. Even Crusader chronicles acknowledge the unprecedented scale of the atrocities. Geoffroy de Villardouin, a participant who later wrote an account of the Crusade, admitted that never, since the world was created, had so much booty been won in any city. Another crusader, Robert de Clary, estimated the plunder as greater than all the wealth in Western Europe combined. Beyond material damage, the sack resulted in incalculable cultural loss. Countless ancient manuscripts, artworks, and historical records perished in fires or wanton destruction. While many treasures were transported to Venice and other Western cities, becoming seeds of Renaissance interest in classical knowledge, far more disappeared forever. The aftermath of conquest brought the establishment of the Latin Empire of Constantinople, with Baldwin of Flanders elected as emperor on May 16, 1204. The Byzantine territories were partitioned among the victors according to the March Agreement, creating a patchwork of Crusader states, Venetian colonies, and Byzantine successor kingdoms in exile. This Latin Empire proved short-lived and unstable. Facing constant military pressure from Bulgarian forces and Byzantine resistance groups based in Nicaea and Epirus, it gradually lost territory and legitimacy. In 1261, forces from the Nicaean Empire under Michael VIII Palaiologos recaptured Constantinople, ending the Latin occupation and restoring a diminished Byzantine state that would survive until the Ottoman conquest of 1453. Pope Innocent III's reaction to the conquest of Constantinople revealed the moral complexity surrounding the Fourth Crusade. Initially, he expressed delight at the prospect of ending the East-West schism through the new Latin Patriarchate. However, as reports of atrocities reached Rome, his perspective shifted dramatically. In letters to the Crusade leadership, he condemned the attack on fellow Christians and the horrific excesses that accompanied the conquest. How, indeed, is the Greek Church to be brought back into ecclesiastical union and to a devotion for the Apostolic See when she has been beset with so many afflictions and persecutions that she sees in the Latins only an example of perdition and the works of darkness, so that she now, and with reason, detests the Latins more than dogs? Despite this condemnation, Innocent recognized the political reality of the Latin Empire's existence and worked to consolidate papal authority over it. This pragmatic accommodation illustrates the competing imperatives facing the medieval papacy, maintaining moral authority while advancing institutional interests. The Fourth Crusade's legacy proved profound and enduring. For Eastern Christians, the sack of Constantinople confirmed their worst suspicions about Western intentions and became a defining trauma in Orthodox historical memory. The theological divide between Eastern and Western Christianity, rather than being healed as Prince Alexios had promised, widened into a chasm that persists to the present day. When Byzantine emperors later faced Ottoman Turkish threats in the 14th and 15th centuries, many Orthodox subjects expressed the sentiment that they would rather see the Sultan's turban in Constantinople than the Pope's tiara. For Western Europe, the Crusade represented both triumph and moral failure. The conquest of Christendom's greatest city demonstrated Latin military capabilities, but undermined the crusading ideal as a holy enterprise. Future expeditions would struggle to recapture the moral clarity and religious fervor of earlier efforts. The material and cultural consequences reverberated for centuries. Venice emerged as the principal beneficiary, using its newly acquired trade monopolies and territories to accelerate its transformation into the dominant Mediterranean commercial power. The vast transfer of wealth, religious relics, and artistic treasures from east to west altered the cultural landscape of Europe, particularly in Italy, where Byzantine influences contributed to the early stirrings of Renaissance aesthetics and scholarship. Perhaps most significantly, the Crusade fundamentally realigned Mediterranean power structures at a critical historical juncture. The weakening of Byzantium as a buffer between Europe and the Islamic world created a power vacuum that would eventually be filled by the rising Ottoman state. The bitter memory of Latin betrayal undermined potential Christian cooperation against this emerging threat, indirectly facilitating the eventual Ottoman conquest of Constantinople and southeastern Europe. The Fourth Crusade thus stands as a watershed in medieval history, a moment when the crusading movement's internal contradictions became fully manifest, when religious idealism collided catastrophically with political and economic imperatives, and when the complex interrelationship between Eastern and Western Christianity was irrevocably altered. What began as an expedition to recover Jerusalem ended by changing the course of European and Mediterranean history in ways none of its participants could have foreseen. The devastating outcome of the Fourth Crusade left the crusading movement in disarray. The conquest of Constantinople had strengthened Western European presence in the Eastern Mediterranean, but fundamentally undermined the moral authority of crusading as a concept. Pope Innocent III, despite his initial enthusiasm for crusading activity, found himself presiding over a perversion of the movement's original purpose: Christian warriors attacking fellow Christians rather than recovering Jerusalem. Determined to restore crusading to its intended trajectory, Innocent convened the Fourth Lateran Council in November 1215. This extraordinary gathering, the largest ecclesiastical assembly of the medieval period, brought together over 400 bishops, 800 abbots, and numerous secular rulers to address church reform, heresy, and the recovery of the Holy Land. The council's planning for a new crusade represented Innocent's attempt to rehabilitate the crusading ideal and redirect Western military energy toward legitimate religious objectives. The council's crusading decree, Ad Liberandum, outlined a comprehensive strategy, drawing on lessons from previous expeditions. Innocent retained the focus on Egypt established before the Fourth Crusade, recognizing its strategic importance as the economic and military center of Ayyubid power. The Pope imposed a 3-year church tax to finance the venture, prohibited trade with Muslim territories, and established multiple departure points to avoid the logistical bottleneck that had contributed to the Fourth Crusade's diversion. Most significantly, the council mandated direct papal oversight of the entire enterprise. No longer would Crusade leadership be entrusted primarily to secular rulers with their competing political agendas. The Pope would assign a papal legate as supreme authority, theoretically ensuring that religious objectives remained paramount over political or economic interests. Innocent did not live to see his vision implemented. He died in July 1216, leaving his successor, Honorius III, to execute the carefully constructed crusade plan. Initial recruitment efforts focused on the kings of Europe, but with limited success. Philip II of France remained aloof, still mindful of the difficulties his father had experienced during the Second Crusade. The young Henry III of England proved too occupied with internal challenges to participate. Emperor Frederick II of Germany took the cross, but repeatedly delayed his departure, citing pressing matters in his diverse territories. Leadership eventually fell to lesser but still significant nobles: King Andrew II of Hungary, Duke Leopold VI of Austria, and John of Brienne, the titular king of Jerusalem, who ruled the rump state centered on Acre. These leaders, while committed to the crusading ideal, lacked the resources and authority of the monarchs who had led the Third Crusade. King Andrew's Hungarian contingent arrived first in the Holy Land in the fall of 1217. His approach to crusading proved frustrating to local authorities. Rather than pursuing coordinated military objectives, Andrew focused on collecting relics and conducting pilgrimages to holy sites. After a few inconclusive skirmishes with Muslim forces, he declared his vow fulfilled and returned to Hungary in January 1218, taking many of his knights with him. This inauspicious start gave way to more determined leadership under Leopold of Austria and John of Brienne. Reinforced by contingents from Germany, Italy, France, and England, they implemented the Egyptian strategy designed by the Lateran Council. In May 1218, the Crusader army landed near Damietta, a fortified port city controlling access to the Nile Delta. Damietta represented an ideal strategic target. Located on the easternmost branch of the Nile, the city functioned as both a major trading center and a crucial defensive position guarding the water route to Cairo. Its capture would provide the Crusaders with a secure base for operations deeper into Egypt, potentially forcing Sultan al-Kamil, Saladin's brother and successor, to negotiate Jerusalem's return. The initial phase of the siege focused on a massive chain tower in the Nile that protected the harbor. After several failed assaults, Crusader engineers constructed an innovative floating siege platform, 2 ships lashed together supporting a scaling ladder. This device enabled a daring attack in August 1218 that captured the tower, breaking the city's river defenses. Despite this success, the main city remained defiant. The Crusaders established a fortified camp and settled in for a prolonged siege. Conditions proved challenging for both sides. The Crusader camp suffered from the Egyptian climate, unfamiliar diseases, and occasional flooding. Within Damietta, the situation grew increasingly desperate as the besieged population faced dwindling supplies and mounting casualties. The siege's duration allowed time for substantial reinforcements to reach the Crusader camp. Cardinal Pelagius of Albano arrived in September 1218 as the papal legate designated by Honorius III. His presence fundamentally altered the expedition's command structure and decision-making process. Asserting the authority granted by the Lateran Council, Pelagius effectively superseded John of Brienne's military leadership, creating tensions that would ultimately undermine the Crusades' effectiveness. A notable arrival during the siege was Francis of Assisi, founder of the Franciscan religious order. Seeking to end bloodshed and convert Muslims to Christianity, Francis crossed battle lines in September 1219 to meet with Sultan al-Kamil. Though details of their conversation remain unclear, contemporary sources indicate that the Sultan received Francis respectfully and allowed him to preach before sending him safely back to the Crusader camp. This remarkable episode, a peaceful dialogue amid bitter conflict, demonstrated alternative approaches to cross-cultural interaction in an age dominated by military confrontation. After 18 months of siege, Damietta finally fell to the Crusaders in November 1219. Starvation and disease had reduced the city's population from an estimated 60,000 to fewer than 10,000. When Crusader forces entered the city, they found streets littered with unburied corpses and few survivors capable of resistance. The conquest, achieved through persistence rather than direct assault, delivered to the Crusaders a nearly intact city with valuable infrastructure and defensive capabilities. The fall of Damietta represented the high watermark of the Fifth Crusade, With this significant Egyptian port under their control, the Crusaders had successfully implemented the strategic concept that had eluded the Fourth Crusade. Sultan al-Kamil, recognizing the threat to his capital at Cairo, offered remarkably favorable terms: the complete restoration of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, including the Holy City itself, in exchange for Crusader withdrawal from Egypt. This extraordinary proposal, offering without bloodshed what 4 previous crusades had failed to achieve through warfare, created profound disagreement within Crusader leadership. King John of Brienne, the military orders, and many secular nobles favored accepting the offer. They recognized the practical challenges of holding territory in Egypt versus the realistic possibility of re-establishing the Christian kingdom in its traditional heartland. Cardinal Pelagius, however, rejected the proposal. With continued reinforcements arriving from Europe, he believed total victory in Egypt remained possible. Some historians suggest he also considered the Sultan's offer a diplomatic trap, designed to remove the Crusader threat from Egypt before reneging on the Jerusalem transfer. Others point to Pelagius's papal instructions, which may have emphasized complete victory over negotiated settlement. Whatever his reasoning, Pelagius's rejection of Al-Kamil's offer stands as one of the crusading movement's most consequential diplomatic failures. Jerusalem, the recovery of which constituted the movement's core purpose, was within reach through negotiation, yet the opportunity passed unrealized due to internal disputes and strategic miscalculation. The Crusader army remained in Damietta for nearly a year after its capture, enjoying the city's comforts while debating next steps. This delay proved strategically catastrophic. It allowed Al-Kamil to strengthen Cairo's defenses, rebuild his military forces, and reconcile with his brothers Al-Mu'azzam of Damascus and Al-Ashraf of the Jazeera, creating a united Muslim front against the invaders. In July 1221, reinforced by troops under Duke Ludwig of Bavaria and believing Frederick II's long-promised arrival imminent, Pelagius overruled continuing objections from King John and ordered an advance toward Cairo. The Crusader army, numbering perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 fighting men, followed the Nile's eastern branch southward. They captured the fortress of Sharamzah and continued to the fork in the Nile at Mansoura, where the Damietta branch meets the main river. By August, the Crusaders established a camp near Al-Adiliya, southwest of Mansoura. Their position, though seemingly advantageous, contained a fatal vulnerability. It occupied low ground between the Nile and its canals, in a region subject to annual flooding. Sultan al-Kamil, familiar with Egypt's geography and climate, recognized this weakness. As the Crusaders prepared for a final advance on Cairo, the Sultan ordered the Nile dams broken. Water levels rose rapidly around the Crusader camp, trapping the army on ever-shrinking islands of dry ground. Simultaneously, the Egyptian fleet controlled the river, cutting off retreat to Damietta. The Crusader position quickly transformed from offensive to desperate. With supplies dwindling and no possibility of advance or effective retreat, Pelagius was forced to negotiate from a position of extreme weakness. The resulting treaty required complete Crusader evacuation of Egypt, including abandonment of Damietta, in exchange for an 8-year truce and the return of a supposed fragment of the True Cross. The Crusaders also had to release all prisoners without receiving their own captives in return. On September 8, 1221, the remnants of the Crusader army marched out of Egypt, having transformed a position of significant advantage into comprehensive defeat. The Fifth Crusade, despite its promising beginning and the capture of a major strategic objective, ultimately failed to recover any territory in the Holy Land or meaningfully improve the Christian position in the Eastern Mediterranean. This outcome had profound implications for the crusading movement. The strategic concept focusing on Egypt had proven sound. Damietta's capture had indeed forced Al-Kamil to offer Jerusalem. However, the execution had failed due to divided leadership, delayed decision-making, and poor tactical choices in the final campaign. The Lateran Council's model of direct papal control through a legate had not produced more effective leadership than previous arrangements under secular authority. Responsibility for the failure generated heated contemporary debate. Supporters of Pelagius blamed John of Brienne's reluctance and the absence of Frederick II, whose promised forces might have tipped the balance. John's partisans highlighted Pelagius's rejection of favorable peace terms and his military inexperience. Modern historians generally recognize multiple contributing factors: the divided command structure, strategic delays after Damietta's capture, and fundamental miscalculations about Egyptian geography and climate. For the papacy, the Fifth Crusade represented a significant investment of institutional prestige and resources, with disappointing returns. The comprehensive planning process established by the Lateran Council had successfully launched the expedition, but failed to ensure effective field leadership or strategic decision-making. Future crusades would continue to struggle with the inherent tension between papal authority and practical military leadership. Among the most significant outcomes of the failed crusade was the further development of the military orders, particularly the Templars and Hospitallers, as the primary institutional defenders of Christian interests in the Holy Land. These organizations, with their permanent presence and specialized experience, increasingly dominated strategic planning and defensive operations between major crusades. For European observers, the Fifth Crusade reinforced growing skepticism about the practical achievability of crusading objectives. The movement had now experienced 5 major expeditions, with only the first achieving substantial, lasting territorial gains. This pattern of diminishing returns contributed to evolving concepts of crusading that emphasized alternate approaches, diplomatic engagement, targeted expeditions, or focusing on different geographic theaters like the Baltic or Iberian Peninsula. The Muslim world, particularly the Ayyubid dynasty under Al-Kamil, demonstrated both military resilience and diplomatic sophistication during the conflict. Having repelled the invasion, Al-Kamil would continue engaging diplomatically with Western powers, recognizing that negotiation often served his interests better than protracted warfare. This pragmatic approach would shape his later interactions with Frederick II during the Sixth Crusade, producing outcomes that military confrontation had repeatedly failed to achieve. The Sixth Crusade stands as one of the most unusual episodes in crusading history. A campaign that achieved through diplomacy what 5 previous expeditions had largely failed to accomplish through warfare. Its central figure, Emperor Frederick II Hohenstaufen, employed methods that defied crusading conventions while securing results that traditional military approaches had not attained. This unorthodox success, however, generated as much controversy as celebration, revealing the complex interplay of religion, politics, and personality that characterized the later crusading movement. Frederick II emerged as perhaps the most remarkable ruler of the medieval period. Crowned King of Sicily at age 3, King of Germany at 18, and Holy Roman Emperor at 26, he controlled territories stretching from the Baltic to Sicily. Educated in Palermo's cosmopolitan environment, he developed intellectual interests spanning science, philosophy, languages, and governance that earned him the epithet Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. Frederick's relationship with the crusading movement began at his imperial coronation in 1220, where he took a formal crusading vow before Pope Honorius III. This commitment carried particular significance given Frederick's 1225 marriage to Isabella, II of Jerusalem, which made him titular King of Jerusalem and created a personal stake in recovering the Holy City. Despite these incentives, Frederick repeatedly delayed his departure, citing instability within his domains and conflicts with the Lombard cities of northern Italy. Pope Honorius displayed remarkable patience with these postponements, but his successor, Gregory IX, proved less accommodating. When Frederick again delayed his departure in 1227, citing illness, Gregory excommunicated him, creating the unprecedented situation of an excommunicate emperor leading a papal crusade. Frederick, determined to fulfill his vow despite ecclesiastical censure, departed for the East in June 1228, with a relatively small force of approximately 800 knights and 10,000 infantry. The political situation in the Levant upon Frederick's arrival proved unexpectedly favorable for diplomatic initiatives. Sultan al-Kamil, who had defeated the Fifth Crusade, faced significant challenges to his authority within the fragmented Ayyubid realms. His brother, al-Muazzam of Damascus, had died in 1227, creating a succession crisis in Syria. Al-Kamil supported his nephew an-Nasir against another brother, al-Ashraf, in a complex power struggle that made Western alliance temporarily attractive. Frederick had established diplomatic contacts with Al-Kamil several years earlier, exchanging gifts and philosophical discussions through envoys. The emperor's diplomatic approach reflected his multicultural upbringing and intellectual curiosity. Unlike most Western rulers, Frederick maintained a court that included Muslim scholars, spoke Arabic, and demonstrated genuine interest in Islamic culture. These qualities, while suspect to many Europeans, positioned him uniquely for cross-cultural negotiation. Upon arriving in Acre in September 1228, Frederick faced a complex reception. As an excommunicated ruler, he could not demand traditional obedience from the military orders or the church hierarchy. The Templars and Hospitallers accompanied his army, but maintained minimal cooperation, refusing joint military operations. Patriarch Gerald of Jerusalem opposed Frederick's presence entirely, viewing him as a dangerous usurper of both imperial and royal authority. Undeterred by this fractious welcome, Frederick initiated direct negotiations with Al-Kamil. The exact content of these discussions remains incompletely documented, but both rulers recognized potential advantages in a peaceful settlement. Frederick needed a significant accomplishment to rehabilitate his standing in Europe, while Al-Kamil sought to secure his position against rival family members. After 5 months of complex negotiations, the two rulers concluded the Treaty of Jaffa el Ajul on February 18, 1229. Its terms achieved what generations of crusaders had fought and died to secure. Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth, along with a corridor to the coast, would return to Christian control. Muslims would retain religious rights at the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, two of Islam's holiest sites located on the Temple Mount. Both sides would respect a 10-year truce, with Frederick pledging to defend Al-Kamil against all enemies, including potential Christian attackers. This diplomatic achievement generated polarized reactions. For Frederick's supporters, the treaty vindicated his innovative approach. Through negotiation, he had recovered Christianity's holiest sites without bloodshed, demonstrating a pragmatic wisdom his predecessors had lacked. For his detractors, the treaty represented an unconscionable compromise with religious enemies, particularly in allowing continued Muslim worship in Jerusalem. The circumstances of Frederick's entry into Jerusalem underscored these contradictions. On March 17th, 1229, he processed into the Holy City as its Christian ruler, a triumphant moment that fulfilled the core objective of the entire crusading movement. Yet no clergy would perform religious ceremonies due to his excommunication. In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Frederick reportedly placed the crown of Jerusalem on his own head, as no religious authority would crown an excommunicate emperor. During his brief stay in Jerusalem, Frederick displayed the intellectual curiosity and respect for other cultures that defined his reign. He reportedly engaged Muslim scholars in philosophical discussions, examined Islamic architectural features with genuine appreciation, and assured Muslim religious authorities of his intention to respect the treaty's provisions regarding their holy sites. These behaviors, while reflecting Frederick's cosmopolitan outlook, further scandalized Western religious conservatives. The contradictions of Frederick's crusade reached their apex when he received news that papal forces had invaded his Italian territories during his absence. Gregory IX, not content with excommunicating Frederick, had declared a crusade against the emperor's lands, creating the extraordinary situation of crusaders fighting in Italy while the Holy City was being peacefully recovered in Palestine. This development forced Frederick to abbreviate his stay in the East. He departed in May 1229, having spent barely 2 months in his recovered kingdom. Before leaving, Frederick established governance structures for the recovered territories, appointing Balian of Sidon as his representative. He also ordered the reconstruction of Jerusalem's walls, recognizing that his diplomatic achievement required physical defense to endure. These practical measures reflected Frederick's pragmatic approach to kingship, prioritizing functional administration over ideological purity. Upon returning to Italy, Frederick quickly defeated the papal forces and secured his territories. His military success, combined with the undeniable achievement of recovering Jerusalem, strengthened his negotiating position with Gregory IX. In 1230, the Treaty of San Germano reconciled emperor and pope, lifting Frederick's excommunication and temporarily resolving their conflict. Though future disagreements would reignite this fundamental struggle between imperial and papal authority, Frederick had demonstrated his ability to pursue independent policies while maintaining essential church relationships. The territories recovered through the Sixth Crusade remained under Christian control for 15 years, longer than might have been expected, given the limited military resources supporting the diplomatic agreement. The Muslim world, particularly conservative religious elements, criticized Al-Kamil for surrendering Jerusalem, yet practical implementation of the treaty proceeded relatively smoothly, with pilgrims able to visit holy sites under conditions of reasonable security. In 1239, after Al-Kamil's death, the treaty's provisions began to unravel. An-Nasir Dawood, the displaced ruler of Damascus, seized and refortified areas around Jerusalem, directly violating the agreement. Western forces under Theobald IV of Champagne and Richard of Cornwall mounted limited expeditions, sometimes called the Barons' Crusades, attempting to enforce or renegotiate treaty terms. These efforts achieved temporary diplomatic extensions, but failed to establish sustainable Christian control. In 1244, the situation deteriorated catastrophically when Khwarezmian mercenaries, Turkish warriors displaced by the Mongol invasions further east, captured Jerusalem, slaughtering its Christian population and desecrating holy sites. This disaster demonstrated the fundamental weakness of diplomatic arrangements, unsupported by adequate military strength. The Holy City would remain under Muslim control until the 20th century, rendering Frederick's achievement impressive but ultimately temporary. The Sixth Crusade's legacy proved complex and contested. Frederick's diplomatic approach demonstrated possibilities for interreligious accommodation that traditional crusading ideology had largely rejected. His willingness to negotiate with Muslim rulers, respect their religious sensibilities, and seek mutually beneficial arrangements represented a significant evolution in Western engagement with the Islamic world. Simultaneously, Frederick's methods challenged fundamental assumptions about crusading purposes and procedures. The movement had developed as a form of armed pilgrimage and holy warfare, activities presuming fundamental religious antagonism. Frederick's pragmatic diplomacy, respect for Islamic culture, and willingness to allow Muslim worship in Jerusalem all contradicted these foundational concepts, suggesting alternative paradigms for East-West interaction. For the papacy, the Sixth Crusade represented a profound challenge to institutional authority. An excommunicated emperor had achieved what papal armies could not, undermining claims that divine favor necessarily accompanied papal leadership. Gregory IX's declaration of a crusade against Frederick's territories, while the emperor recovered Jerusalem, revealed the increasingly political application of crusading mechanisms, a development that would further erode the movement's religious credibility. The broader crusading movement never fully reconciled the contradictions Frederick's expedition revealed. Subsequent crusades would continue pursuing traditional military approaches against Islamic powers, largely rejecting the diplomatic alternatives Frederick had demonstrated. This reversion to conventional methods partly reflected genuine religious conviction about crusading's spiritual purposes, but also indicated the limited applicability of Frederick's unique personal qualities and circumstances to broader East-West relations. Perhaps the most significant aspect of the Sixth Crusade was its demonstration that Jerusalem, the emotional and spiritual heart of the crusading movement, could be recovered through methods other than conquest. This achievement, however temporary, suggested that religious objectives might be attainable through pragmatic engagement rather than categorical opposition. This insight, though largely unincorporated into medieval Christian practice, represented an important alternative vision of intercultural relations in an age dominated by religious warfare. Frederick II himself never returned to the East, focusing instead on consolidating his complex European domains and continuing his struggle with successive popes. His crusading achievement, though touted by imperial propagandists, became overshadowed by his broader conflicts with papal authority. When he died in 1250, the Christian presence in Jerusalem had already been destroyed by the Khwarezmian attack, and the Crusader states faced increasing pressure from ascendant Muslim powers. The Sixth Crusade thus stands as an anomaly in crusading history, an expedition led by an excommunicated emperor who achieved through diplomacy what armies had failed to secure through combat, yet whose accomplishment proved as temporary as those gained through traditional warfare. This paradoxical outcome reflected both the possibilities and limitations of cross-cultural engagement in the medieval Mediterranean world, where religious ideology, political pragmatism, and individual personality created unexpected historical trajectories. The violent recapture of Jerusalem by the Khwarezmian Turks in 1244 sent shockwaves through Western Christendom. The Holy City, which Frederick II had recovered through diplomacy just 15 years earlier, was once again lost, its Christian inhabitants massacred, and its holy sites desecrated. This catastrophe was compounded by the crushing defeat of Christian forces at La Fourbi, Harbia, in October 1244, where an alliance of Crusader states and Damascus Muslims was routed by combined Egyptian and Khwarezmian armies. The news reached Europe as the papacy struggled with ongoing conflict against Emperor Frederick II. Pope Innocent IV, who had declared Frederick deposed at the Council of Lyon in 1245, found himself fighting for political survival against imperial forces. Despite these challenges, the Pope recognized the necessity of responding to the Jerusalem crisis, issuing bulls calling for a new crusade. The response among European royalty proved limited. Most monarchs were engaged in conflicts or internal governance challenges that precluded extended Eastern adventures. The crusading appeal found its champion in Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis. Born in 1214 and crowned at age 12, Louis had established himself as a ruler of exceptional piety, administrative ability, and moral authority. His personal religiosity manifested in practices unusual for medieval monarchs. He attended multiple masses daily, engaged in severe self-mortification, and personally fed and cared for lepers. These behaviors, while extreme by modern standards, reflected genuine spiritual commitment recognized by contemporaries. Louis's decision to crusade stemmed from a near-death experience during a severe illness in 1244. Having temporarily lost consciousness, the king reported vowing to undertake a crusade upon recovery. When news of Jerusalem's fall arrived shortly thereafter, Louis interpreted this concatenation as divine confirmation of his vow. Despite objections from his mother, Blanche of Castile, and many advisors, Louis remained steadfast in his commitment to the expedition. Preparation for the Seventh Crusade demonstrated Louis's administrative acumen and attention to detail. Unlike previous hastily organized expeditions, Louis spent 4 years systematically addressing logistical, financial, and diplomatic prerequisites. He imposed substantial taxes throughout France, including an unprecedented levy on church revenues. These financial measures generated significant resistance but provided essential funding for sustained operations. Louis also pursued diplomatic initiatives designed to secure safe passage and potential allies. He negotiated with Emperor Frederick II for Mediterranean transit rights, exchanged envoys with various Mongol leaders exploring possible collaboration against Muslim powers, and strengthened French naval capabilities through agreements with Genoa and Marseille. These preparations reflected Louis's understanding that previous crusades had failed partly through inadequate logistical foundations. The expedition departed from Aigues-Mortes in southern France on August 25, 1248. Louis had assembled approximately 15,000 men, including 2,500 knights, transported on a fleet of 36 ships. The force first sailed to Cyprus, the staging area Frederick II had established during the Sixth Crusade, where they spent the winter gathering additional supplies and awaiting reinforcements. During this 8-month Cyprus sojourn, Louis convened extensive strategic discussions. Drawing on lessons from the Fifth Crusade, he resolved to attack Egypt first, recognizing its economic and military centrality to Ayyubid power. The original target, Damietta, remained attractive for its strategic position, controlling access to the Nile Delta and the water route to Cairo. The Crusader fleet departed Cyprus on May 13, 1249, and reached the Egyptian coast near Damietta on June 4th. The landing faced immediate opposition from Ayyubid forces positioned along the shoreline. In one of the Crusade's most dramatic moments, Louis himself leaped from his ship into chest-high water, leading his knights ashore under enemy fire. This personal courage inspired the French troops, who successfully established a beachhead and drove the Egyptian defenders from their positions. To the Crusaders' surprise, Egyptian forces hastily abandoned Damietta the following day, retreating toward Cairo without destroying the city's provisions or infrastructure. This unexpected development seemed providential, repeating a key success of the Fifth Crusade without the extended siege that had depleted earlier Crusader resources. Louis ordered the army to occupy the intact city, established proper administration, and prepared for the advance toward Cairo. At this critical juncture, Louis made a fateful decision to await the arrival of his brother Alphonse of Poitiers with additional forces before proceeding inland. This delay, extending from June to November 1249, sacrificed momentum and allowed the Egyptians to strengthen defenses. The Crusaders found themselves repeating the Fifth Crusade's strategic error, granting their opponents valuable preparation time while environmental conditions deteriorated with the approaching Nile flood season. The political situation in Egypt during this period underwent significant transformation. Sultan as-Salih Ayyub died in November 1249, creating a potentially destabilizing succession crisis. His capable wife, Shajar al-Dur, concealed his death until his son Turanshah could return from Mesopotamia to assume power. This transition occurred without the internal fragmentation the Crusaders might have exploited, demonstrating the administrative resilience of the Egyptian state. On November 20th, 1249, with Alphonse of Poitiers finally arrived, the Crusader army began its advance toward Cairo. Moving along the Damietta branch of the Nile, they aimed for Mansoura, the same objective that had proven disastrous for the Fifth Crusade. By December, they reached the junction of the Nile and the Bahr al-Saghir Canal, directly opposite Mansoura. Here they encountered their first major obstacle. The Egyptian army had established defensive positions on the southern bank, preventing river crossing. For nearly 2 months, the Crusaders attempted various engineering solutions to bridge the water barrier, including building a causeway into the river. Egyptian forces systematically destroyed these works using projectile weapons, Greek fire, and targeted sorties. The stalemate persisted until a local Coptic Christian revealed information about a fordable section of the Bahr al-Saghir several miles downstream. On February 8th, 1250, Louis dispatched his brother, Robert of Artois, with the Templars, and selected knights to secure this crossing and establish a bridgehead. After successfully fording the canal, Robert disregarded explicit instructions to await the main army. Instead, overconfident from the initial success, he led a cavalry charge directly into Mansoura. The Crusader vanguard briefly penetrated the city, creating momentary panic among Egyptian forces. This initial advantage quickly transformed into disaster. The narrow streets of Mansoura prevented effective cavalry maneuver, while Egyptian troops under the Mamluk commander Baibars rallied and counterattacked. Robert and nearly the entire advance force were surrounded and killed, including hundreds of Templars and English knights under William Longsword. This catastrophic loss of elite heavy cavalry significantly reduced Crusader offensive capabilities. Louis arrived with the main army to find his vanguard destroyed, but managed to establish a defensive position outside Mansoura. For the next 2 months, the opposing armies engaged in a war of attrition, punctuated by Egyptian attacks and Crusader counteroffensives. The French, initially, maintained discipline and adequate supplies, but their situation deteriorated as Egyptian control of the river blocked reinforcement and resupply from Damietta. By late March, the Crusader camp faced severe food shortages. Nutritional deficiencies combined with poor sanitation produced a devastating outbreak of scurvy and dysentery. Contemporary accounts describe horrific conditions: soldiers with blackened gums unable to eat, open sores covering bodies, and mass deaths overwhelming burial capabilities. Louis himself fell ill but refused evacuation, insisting on remaining with his troops. As April 1250 began, the military situation had become untenable. Louis ordered a general retreat toward Damietta on April 5th, but Egyptian forces quickly surrounded the withdrawing army. Near the town of Fariskur, the Crusaders sustained a decisive defeat. Louis, too weak from illness to ride, was captured along with his surviving brothers and most of the French nobility. The majority of common soldiers were executed, with only those possessing specialized skills or ransom value preserved. Louis's capture created unprecedented diplomatic challenges. Never before had a reigning European monarch fallen prisoner to Muslim forces. The French king demonstrated remarkable composure during his captivity, maintaining royal dignity while negotiating realistic terms. After several weeks of complex discussions, a ransom agreement emerged. Louis would surrender Damietta and pay 400,000 livres tournois, approximately 30 tons of silver, for the release of himself and his nobles. The conclusion of the Egyptian campaign matched the Fifth Crusade's outcome in practical terms: complete withdrawal from Egypt without territorial gain, but carried greater symbolic significance given the capture of a monarch who embodied Western Christian kingship. For the Muslim world, particularly Egypt, the victory enhanced prestige and demonstrated continued ability to repel Western invasions despite internal political transitions. Upon his release, Louis faced a critical decision. Most prisoners would have returned immediately to Europe following such a defeat, yet the king chose an unexpected path. Rather than abandoning the crusade, he proceeded to Acre, the capital of the remnant kingdom of Jerusalem. This decision reflected both religious conviction about his unfulfilled crusading vow and practical concern for Christian captives still held in Egypt. Louis remained in the Holy Land for 4 years, an unprecedented commitment for a European monarch. During this extended stay, he focused on strengthening the Crusader state's defensive capabilities rather than pursuing additional offensive campaigns. His activities included massive refortification projects at key coastal cities, including Acre, Caesarea, Jaffa, and Sidon. Louis personally participated in construction efforts, physically carrying building materials alongside common laborers as an act of religious humility. Diplomatic initiatives with various regional powers. He exchanged embassies with the Mongols, received delegations from the Assassins, and negotiated with Damascus and Cairo for prisoner exchanges and improved pilgrimage access. Judicial and administrative reforms within the Crusader states, drawing on his governance experience in France to strengthen institutions weakened by decades of military pressure. Financial support for military orders and local baronial forces to maintain defensive capabilities after his departure. These pragmatic measures significantly extended the lifespan of the Crusader states, providing infrastructure and organizational improvements that would help them withstand Muslim pressure for several more decades. Louis's presence also temporarily halted the factional conflicts that had chronically undermined Crusader state effectiveness. The French king's decision to remain in the east became increasingly untenable by 1254. News arrived that his mother, Blanche of Castile, who had served as regent during his absence, had died in November 1252. Without her stabilizing influence, France required its monarch's physical presence to maintain governmental continuity. Louis reluctantly departed Acre on April 24, 1254, having extended his crusade far longer than any previous royal expedition. Upon returning to France, Louis implemented domestic reforms influenced by his crusading experience, particularly in judicial procedures and administrative structures. He maintained contact with Outremer authorities and contributed financial support for ongoing defensive needs. His personal prestige, despite military defeat, remained remarkably intact. Contemporaries attributed the expedition's failure to divine testing rather than royal incompetence. recognizing Louis's genuine religious motivation and personal sacrifice. The most significant long-term consequence of the Seventh Crusade emerged not in Europe, but Egypt. The Ayyubid Sultanate, weakened by succession challenges during the campaign, collapsed shortly after Louis's departure. Power transferred to the Mamluks, elite slave soldiers of Turkish origin, who had played a decisive role in defeating the Crusaders at Mansoura. Under leaders like Baybars, who rose to prominence during the conflict with Louis, the Mamluks would establish a military dynasty that dominated the eastern Mediterranean for centuries. The Seventh Crusade illustrates both continuity and evolution in the crusading movement. Louis's Egyptian strategy directly echoed the Fifth Crusade's approach, reflecting institutional memory about strategic priorities. However, his methodical preparation, extended commitment, and emphasis on defensive consolidation rather than additional offensive campaigning demonstrated learning from previous failures. For contemporaries, the expedition's defining characteristic was Louis's personal piety and commitment. Despite military defeat, his crusading persona became inseparable from idealized Christian kingship. When he undertook a second expedition in 1270, the Eighth Crusade, Louis's ongoing dedication confirmed his reputation as the embodiment of crusading idealism, ultimately contributing to his canonization in 1297. From a military perspective, the Seventh Crusade's failure demonstrated that even exceptional leadership, thorough preparation, and substantial resources could not overcome fundamental strategic and environmental challenges in Egypt. The Nile Delta's geography, with its network of waterways and seasonal flooding, provided defenders with decisive advantages that Western military technology and tactics could not overcome. This reality would influence subsequent crusade planning, with fewer expeditions targeting Egypt directly. Perhaps most significantly, the Seventh Crusade's ultimate impact came through its unintended consequences, particularly the acceleration of the Mamluk rise to power in Egypt. This development would fundamentally alter the region's power dynamics, creating a military regime specifically organized for warfare against both Crusaders and Mongols. Under Mamluk leadership, Muslim forces would systematically reduce the remaining Crusader possessions over the subsequent decades, ultimately eliminating the Latin presence entirely in 1291. Louis IX's First Crusade thus paradoxically contributed to both preserving the Crusader states in the short term through his reconstruction efforts, while indirectly hastening their long-term demise by catalyzing the Mamluk ascendancy. This outcome illustrates the complexity of crusading impact, where immediate objectives and long-term consequences often diverged in unexpected ways, reshaping Mediterranean politics through intricate chains of unintended effects. The 16 years following Louis IX's return from the Holy Land witnessed significant deterioration in the Crusader state's position. The Mamluk Sultanate, which had consolidated power in Egypt after the Seventh Crusade, expanded its control throughout the Levant under the leadership of Sultan Baybars. A former slave soldier who had risen through military prowess, Baybars combined tactical brilliance with strategic vision, systematically targeting Crusader strongholds while neutralizing potential Mongol threats from the east. Baybars's campaigns methodically reduced Crusader territories and fortifications. Caesarea and Arsuf fell in 1265, followed by Saft and Taron in 1266. The March 1268 capture of Jaffa eliminated a key coastal stronghold, while the fall of Antioch in May dealt a devastating psychological blow. The first Crusader state established after the First Crusade had been completely extinguished. By 1270, Christian control had contracted to a handful of coastal cities, with Acre serving as the increasingly vulnerable capital of a fragmented realm. News of these disasters reached Europe through desperate appeals from Crusader state authorities and military orders. Pope Clement IV issued crusading bulls, but the European response proved limited. Most monarchs remained focused on internal concerns or regional conflicts, while broader enthusiasm for crusading had diminished after repeated failures. Even the fall of Antioch, with reports of 17,000 inhabitants massacred and thousands more enslaved, failed to generate a coordinated European response. Into this crisis stepped Louis IX of France, now in his mid-50s and in declining health. Despite his previous defeat, Louis maintained a profound commitment to crusading ideals and continuous interest in the Holy Land's fate. His decision to undertake a second expedition surprised many contemporaries, who considered his earlier defeat and ransom as adequate fulfillment of crusading obligations. Yet the king's personal piety and sense of unfinished religious duty overcame practical objections. Louis announced his decision to crusade again at a Paris assembly in March 1267. Initial recruitment efforts focused on the French nobility, many of whom had accompanied Louis on his first expedition. The response proved mixed. Some veterans committed immediately, while others harbored reservations based on previous experiences. To strengthen participation, Louis secured crusading vows from his sons and brothers, making the expedition a family enterprise that leading nobles could hardly decline to join. Preparations followed the methodical pattern established before the Seventh Crusade. Louis implemented new taxes, purchased and stockpiled supplies, and commissioned specialized transport ships. However, the preparation period was shorter, 3 years versus 4, and financial resources more limited, reflecting both the French crown's constrained circumstances after years of Holy Land subsidies and reduced enthusiasm among the general population for crusade taxation. A crucial development emerged during planning discussions: disagreement over the expedition's target. Louis initially favored returning directly to the Holy Land or Egypt, consistent with traditional crusading objectives. However, his brother, Charles of Anjou, who had acquired the Kingdom of Sicily in 1266, advocated strongly for an attack on Tunis in North Africa. Charles presented multiple rationales for the Tunis target's strategic positioning that would pressure Egypt from the west, while potentially securing a regional base for future operations against Egypt. Economic considerations, as Tunis had defaulted on tribute payments previously made to Sicily, directly affecting Charles's finances. Intelligence suggesting that the Hafsid ruler of Tunis, al-Mustansir, was contemplating conversion to Christianity and might welcome intervention that facilitated this process. This last claim appears particularly doubtful to modern historians, likely representing either deliberate misinformation from Charles or misinterpreted diplomatic language. Nevertheless, Louis found the prospect of facilitating a Muslim ruler's conversion spiritually compelling, aligning with his conception of crusading as advancing Christianity's frontiers, rather than merely recovering territory. The expedition departed from Aigues Mortes on July 1st, 1270, with approximately 10,000 men transported by Genoese ships. The force included significant portions of French nobility and contingents from Catalonia, Frisia, and various Italian cities. After a brief stop at Cagliari in Sardinia for final coordination, the fleet arrived at the site of ancient Carthage near Tunis on July 18th, 1270. Contrary to expectations of potential welcome, the Crusaders faced immediate hostility from local forces. No evidence of the ruler's inclination toward Christianity materialized. Instead, Hafsid troops harassed the landing operation, though they avoided direct major confrontation. The Crusaders established a beachhead and captured the unoccupied Carthage archaeological site, which provided an elevated position for a fortified camp. From this defensive position, Louis apparently intended to provoke a decisive battle with Tunis forces that would either deliver a significant victory or establish negotiating leverage. However, the Hafsid ruler Muhammad al-Mustansir adopted a containment strategy, avoiding direct engagement while allowing the harsh summer environment to degrade the Crusader force. This passive defense proved devastatingly effective. By late July, the combination of extreme heat, inadequate water supplies, poor sanitation, and unfamiliar disease vectors produced a severe health crisis in the Crusader camp. Dysentery spread rapidly through the army, killing soldiers and leaders alike. Among early casualties was Louis's son, John Tristan, ironically born in Damietta during the Seventh Crusade. As July turned to August, conditions further deteriorated. On August 3rd, the papal legate fell ill and died. By August 10th, Louis himself contracted what contemporary sources described as a flux of the stomach accompanied by high fever, likely dysentery complicated by typhoid or typhus. As his condition worsened, Louis reportedly continued conducting royal business and offering spiritual counsel to those around him. On August 25th, 1270, Louis IX died in his tent, reportedly lying on a bed of ashes as a final act of religious humility. His last recorded words, according to his confessor Geoffrey of Beaulieu, were, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem." This deathbed utterance encapsulated the lifelong crusading commitment that had defined his reign, while poignantly acknowledging its unfulfillment. The king's death created an immediate leadership crisis. His eldest son and heir, Philip III, had accompanied the expedition, but was himself seriously ill. Charles of Anjou, arriving from Sicily the day after Louis's death, assumed effective command of the demoralized and disease-ravaged force. Charles recognized the expedition's unsustainable position and negotiated a treaty with al-Mustansir that could reasonably be presented as face-saving rather than defeat. Its terms included a substantial indemnity payment from the Hafsid ruler to cover Crusader expenses, improved treatment of Christian merchants and residents in the Tunis region, permission for Christian missionary activity within Hafsid territories, restoration of tribute payments to Sicily that had been suspended. This agreement, while securing commercial advantages for Charles's Sicilian kingdom, bore minimal relation to traditional crusading objectives. No territory changed hands, no strategic advantage against Egypt materialized, and no significant advancement of Christianity occurred beyond limited missionary permissions. The Crusader force departed North Africa in November 1270, carrying Louis's remains. Their return journey became a further catalogue of disasters. A severe storm struck the fleet near Trapani, Sicily, sinking several ships and drowning approximately 4,000 men, nearly half the remaining force. Among the casualties was Louis's brother-in-law, King Thibaut II of Navarre, along with his wife Isabella, Louis's daughter. The remnants of the once grand expedition gradually dispersed, with most French nobles returning directly home rather than proceeding to the Holy Land. Philip III, recovered from his illness, escorted his father's remains to France, where Louis received burial at Saint-Denis alongside previous French monarchs. Prince Edward of England, the future Edward I, who had arranged to join Louis's crusade, arrived in North Africa after the main force had departed. Undeterred by the expedition's failure, Edward proceeded with his smaller contingent to Acre in 1271, conducting what historians sometimes identify as the Ninth Crusade. His limited operations achieved no significant territorial changes, but briefly bolstered Crusader state morale before his return to England in 1272. The Eighth Crusade stands as perhaps the least effective major crusading expedition. Unlike previous campaigns that at least reached their intended targets before failing, Louis's final crusade never engaged its ultimate objective, whether Tunis was indeed the genuine target or merely a preliminary stage toward Egypt or the Holy Land. The entire operation consumed enormous resources while achieving negligible strategic impact on the Crusader state's increasingly desperate position. For contemporaries, the expedition's most significant outcome was Louis IX's death. The king's demise on crusade, while representing tactical failure, carried profound spiritual symbolism that enhanced his sanctified image. Pope Boniface VIII canonized Louis in 1297, with his crusading activities forming a central element of his saintly reputation. St. Louis became the embodiment of ideal Christian kingship, a monarch who subordinated material interests to spiritual commitments, even at the cost of his life. The campaign's limited achievements must be weighted against its considerable costs. Beyond the financial expenditure, the crusade resulted in thousands of deaths among Europe's military elite, further depleting the leadership resources available for Holy Land defense. The diversion to Tunis, whether motivated by Charles of Anjou's economic interests or genuine strategic calculation, consumed time and manpower that might have directly reinforced struggling Crusader states facing Baibars' systematic campaigns. From a broader historical perspective, the Eighth Crusade illustrates the crusading movement's evolution by the late 13th century. The expedition's hybrid motivations, combining traditional religious objectives with dynastic interests, commercial considerations, and diplomatic manipulation, reflected crusading's increasing complexity as an institution. The original clarity of purpose that animated the First Crusade had given way to multifaceted enterprises serving diverse agendas simultaneously. The campaign also demonstrated the growing gap between crusading ideals and practical implementation. Louis IX personally embodied genuine religious commitment to crusading principles, yet found his expedition shaped by his brother's political and economic interests. This tension between spiritual motivation and material calculation had always existed within the crusading movement, but became increasingly pronounced in later expeditions as political and economic factors gained prominence. For the Hafsid dynasty ruling Tunis, the Crusader attack strengthened their regional position despite the initial disruption. The negotiated settlement with Charles of Anjou, while imposing financial costs, confirmed their diplomatic significance and established more structured relationships with European powers. The episode accelerated the Hafsid realm's integration into Mediterranean diplomatic and commercial networks, though on terms that increasingly favored European interests. Within the broader Islamic world, the Eighth Crusade barely registered compared to Baibars' concurrent campaigns in the Levant. The Mamluk Sultan continued his methodical reduction of Crusader territories throughout 1270 to 1271, unaffected by events in North Africa. The fundamental strategic balance in the Eastern Mediterranean remained unaltered by Louis's final crusading effort. For the Crusader states, the Eighth Crusade represented yet another instance of misdirected European assistance. While desperate appeals from Acre had helped motivate Louis's expedition, the diversion to Tunis meant no reinforcement reached the threatened Christian enclaves. This pattern of crusading forces pursuing objectives tangential to the Crusader state's immediate survival needs had recurred throughout the 13th century, contributing to the growing disconnection between European crusading activities and Levantine political realities. The most enduring consequence of the Eighth Crusade emerged not from its military or political outcomes, but from its contribution to Louis IX's sanctified legacy. St. Louis became the exemplar of crusading kingship. His failed expeditions transformed into spiritual triumphs through the alchemy of hagiography. This idealized image influenced European royal ideology for centuries, particularly in France, where Louis's crusading reputation reinforced connections between monarchy, national identity, and religious mission. Yet beneath this sanctified narrative lay a more complex reality, a costly expedition that failed to reach its ultimate objective, diverted resources from more pressing needs, and illustrated the crusading movement's growing disconnection from its original purpose. Like the crusading ideal itself, Louis's final expedition represented both genuine spiritual aspiration and the practical limitations of implementing religious vision through military means in an increasingly complex political environment. The Ninth Crusade, sometimes considered an extension of the Eighth, represents the final major expedition to the Holy Land undertaken by a European monarch. Led by Prince Edward of England, later King Edward I, this brief campaign marked the conclusion of the classic age of crusading, while foreshadowing the shifting European approach to Middle Eastern engagement that would characterize subsequent centuries. Edward, son of King Henry III and Eleanor of Provence, had taken the cross alongside Louis IX during the French king's recruitment efforts for the Eighth Crusade. A tall, imposing figure with significant military experience from campaigns in England and Wales, Edward brought approximately 1,000 men to what was intended as a supporting role in Louis's larger expedition. When Edward's force reached Tunis in November 1270, they discovered Louis dead, the French army departing, and the original crusading objective abandoned. Rather than returning to Europe with the French, Edward made the remarkable decision to continue to the Holy Land with his relatively small contingent. This choice demonstrated both personal commitment to crusading ideals and pragmatic recognition of political advantages. By fulfilling his crusading vow, Edward enhanced his reputation for religious devotion and chivalric dedication, qualities highly valued in medieval rulership. The expedition also provided valuable experience in Mediterranean politics that would inform his subsequent reign in England. Edward's force sailed from North Africa to Sicily, where they wintered while gathering additional recruits and supplies. By spring 1271, the expedition had grown modestly through the addition of various European nobles and their retinues. The enlarged force proceeded to Acre, the capital of the remnant kingdom of Jerusalem, arriving in May 1271. The situation Edward encountered in Outremer appeared dire. Baibars, the Mamluk Sultan, who had systematically reduced Crusader territories since 1265, controlled most of the interior, including Jerusalem, Antioch, and numerous formerly Christian fortresses. The Crusader presence had contracted to a narrow coastal strip containing Acre, Tyre, Sidon, and a few smaller possessions. Even this limited territory faced constant pressure from Mamluk raids and economic blockades. Despite commanding the largest Western force to reach the Holy Land in several years, Edward recognized that his resources remained insufficient for major offensive operations against Baibars. The Crusader states themselves could provide limited military support, their fighting capacity depleted by years of losses and emigration. The military orders, Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights, maintained effective fighting units, but prioritized defending their remaining castles over joining potentially suicidal field campaigns. Given these constraints, Edward adopted a multifaceted strategy, combining limited military operations, diplomatic initiatives, and defensive preparations. Raids into Muslim-controlled territories around Acre and Nazareth in June-July 1271. which achieved tactical success but secured no permanent territorial gains. Diplomatic outreach to potential allies, particularly the Mongol Ilkhanate under Abaka Khan. The Mongols, who controlled Persia and parts of Mesopotamia, shared hostility toward the Mamluks and had previously corresponded with European leaders about potential military coordination, strengthening fortifications in remaining Crusader territories, particularly around Acre, to enhance defensive capabilities after his departure. This pragmatic approach reflected crusading's evolution from the apocalyptic vision of total victory that had animated the First Crusade to a more realistic management of limited objectives within severe resource constraints. Edward's most significant military operation occurred in November 1271, when a small Mongol force entered northern Syria, creating a potential opportunity for coordinated action. Edward led a raid toward Kakun, south of Acre, hoping to divert Mamluk forces and prevent them from concentrating against the Mongol incursion. While achieving some tactical success, the operation failed in its broader strategic objective. Baibars rapidly defeated the Mongol force before it could link with Crusader elements, demonstrating the Mamluk military's superior mobility and command structure. Following this disappointment, Edward focused increasingly on diplomacy. In May 1272, he negotiated a 10-year, 10-month, and 10-day truce with Baibars. The agreement's terms formally protected remaining Crusader possessions while acknowledging the existing territorial status quo, essentially recognizing Mamluk dominance while providing temporary security for Christian coastal enclaves. During these negotiations, Edward survived an assassination attempt that has become the most frequently recounted episode of his crusade. On June 17, 1272, an Ismaili envoy who had established himself in Edward's household over several months attacked the prince with a poisoned dagger. Edward killed the assassin, but sustained a wound that contemporary sources describe as potentially fatal. The episode's circumstances remain disputed by historians. Medieval Christian accounts asserted Baibars orchestrated the attack, while some modern scholars suggest it may have represented private Ismaili initiative or even fabrication to enhance Edward's reputation. Regardless of its origin, Edward's survival and recovery contributed significantly to his heroic image. His wife Eleanor reportedly sucked poison from the wound, a romantic embellishment unlikely in medical terms, but powerful in chivalric storytelling. While recovering from this injury, Edward received news that fundamentally altered his crusading trajectory. His father, Henry III, had died on November 16, 1272, making Edward King of England. This development necessitated his return to secure his throne, particularly given ongoing political tensions following the Second Barons' War. On September 24, 1272, Edward departed Acre, bringing the final major crusading expedition to a conclusion. Edward's crusade achieved little in territorial terms. No significant land changed hands, no major fortresses were recaptured, and the fundamental strategic balance remained unaltered. However, the expedition temporarily bolstered Christian morale in the remaining Crusader territories and secured a truce that provided a decade of relative stability, no small achievement given their precarious position. Perhaps most significantly, the Ninth Crusade established diplomatic precedents that would influence subsequent European engagement with Middle Eastern powers. Edward's outreach to the Mongol Ilkhanate represented an early example of European powers seeking regional allies against perceived common enemies, an approach that would characterize much later Western diplomacy in the region. The negotiated truce with Baibars similarly foreshadowed the growing European recognition that commercial and political arrangements might advance their interests more effectively than additional military campaigns. For Baibars and the Mamluk Sultanate, Edward's crusade represented a minor distraction amid broader strategic concerns. The greater threat came from Mongol forces to the east rather than the limited western expedition. Having systematically reduced Crusader territories in previous campaigns, Baibars could afford a temporary truce that allowed him to consolidate gains and address other frontiers. The Sultan died in 1277, having transformed the Mamluk state into the dominant regional power and established the military system that would eventually eliminate the remaining Crusader presence. Edward returned to England to begin a significant reign, 1272 to 1307, characterized by legal reforms, parliamentary development, and territorial consolidation. His crusading experience informed aspects of his kingship, particularly his approach to warfare in Wales and Scotland, where he applied lessons in logistics and siege techniques. Edward maintained interest in crusading affairs throughout his reign, periodically discussing potential new expeditions, though practical governance demands prevented his return to the Holy Land. Following Edward's departure, the Crusader states entered their final phase. The truce negotiated with Baibars provided temporary respite, but could not address their fundamental weakness. Increasingly dependent on Italian commercial interests and military order garrisons, these territories functioned more as trade colonies than viable independent states. Despite occasional discussions of new crusades among European monarchs, no significant expedition materialized before the final collapse. This end came under Sultan Qalawun and his son Al-Ashraf Khalil, who systematically eliminated remaining Crusader possessions in the 1380s. Tripoli fell in 1289, followed by smaller coastal holdings. The final siege of Acre began in April 1291, with Mamluk forces vastly outnumbering the city's defenders. Despite desperate resistance from the military orders, Acre fell on May 18, 1291. The remaining Christian outposts, Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, and Tortosa, surrendered or were abandoned shortly thereafter, bringing the nearly 2-century Latin presence in the Levant to a definitive conclusion. The Ninth Crusade thus stands as the final chapter in the traditional narrative of crusading to the Holy Land. While later, smaller expeditions occurred, and crusading rhetoric continued to animate European military activities in other theatres, no subsequent force approached the scale or ambition of the major numbered crusades. Edward's pragmatic, limited campaign foreshadowed the transformation of European engagement with the Eastern Mediterranean, from primarily military religious to diplomatic commercial in nature. This transition reflected broader shifts in European society, politics, and economic organization. The rise of centralized monarchies focused on territorial consolidation reduced royal enthusiasm for distant campaigns. Growing commercial networks created constituencies favoring trade relationships over religious warfare. The military orders, transformed by the loss of their original purpose, evolved toward banking, territorial rule in other regions, or merger with national monarchies. The crusading ideal itself underwent significant evolution rather than disappearance. The concept of armed pilgrimage and holy warfare against non-believers remained powerful in European culture, finding expression in various contexts: Spanish Reconquista, Baltic campaigns against pagans, anti-heretical operations, and eventually European colonial expansion. Each manifestation retained elements of the original crusading concept while adapting to different circumstances and objectives. For the Islamic world, particularly the Mamluk Sultanate, the final victory over Crusader territories represented significant achievement, but relatively modest strategic change. The Latin presence had already contracted to economically valuable but militarily negligible coastal enclaves before their elimination. The greater challenge remained the Mongol threat from the east, which would continue to shape Mamluk military and diplomatic priorities for decades. The end of the numbered Crusades did not terminate Christian-Muslim interaction in the eastern Mediterranean. Pilgrimage to holy sites continued under Muslim governance, facilitated by Franciscan custodianship of key Christian locations. Commercial relationships flourished between European merchants and Mamluk authorities. Diplomatic exchanges became increasingly sophisticated, with European powers establishing more permanent representation in Muslim capitals. This evolving relationship laid foundations for early modern patterns of interaction between Europe and the Middle East. The rise of Ottoman power in the 14th to 15th centuries would create new regional dynamics, but within frameworks partially established during the Crusading period. European commercial, religious, and diplomatic engagement with the region continued developing along trajectories visible in Edward's pragmatic approach during the final major crusade. The Ninth Crusade thus represents not merely an endpoint, but a transition, the conclusion of a particular phase in Mediterranean history, and the beginning of new patterns of cross-cultural engagement. Edward's expedition, modest in military terms, illustrated the practical limitations that had overtaken Crusading's ambitious vision, while demonstrating the diplomatic and commercial alternatives that would increasingly characterize European interaction with the Islamic world in subsequent centuries.